In a wonderful letter to a church in Rome, the Apostle Paul writes, "Welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you." Well, it's in just that spirit that we welcome one another to our virtual Monte Vista Grove Homes Convocation today. Our scripture reading is Psalm 69, verses from Psalm 69. We're going to put that reading on a screen right now, and I'm going to ask you to read with me in unison. Together. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me. I am weary with my crying. My throat is parched. My eyes grow dim and waiting for my God. My prayer is to you, O Lord. At an acceptable time, O God, in the abundance of your steadfast love, answer me. With your faithful help, rescue me from sinking in the mire. Let me be delivered from mine enemies and from the deep waters. Do not let the flood sweep over me, or the deep swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me. For the Lord hears the needy and does not despise the Lord's own who are in bonds. Now we're going to use this liturgy. It's a responsive reading. I will begin, to be followed by all. God sends the church to work for justice in the world, exercising its power for the common good, dealing honestly in personal and public spheres, seeking dignity and freedom for all people. As followers of Jesus Christ, who loves all and calls us to challenge the unjust structures of church and society, we are called to work for justice and peace for all God's people. Hear us, our God, as we join the collection of voices lamenting the persistence of injustice, even as we lament hearing our complicity of silence. We resolve to obey the call to be a mouthpiece of justice, a people who stand with the suffering. Hear us, our God, as we join this day, the collection of voices claiming dignity, preciousness, and justice for the life of our sister, our daughter, our grandchild. We say her name together, Breonna Taylor, Breonna Taylor. You have called us to lead the faithful. May we faithfully lead, recognizing the places where we have power to bear witness and resound voice to affect change in every place where injustice and silence persist. Lord, hear our prayers. Now in silence, we pray for victims and families of racial violence, for sisters and brothers in our communities crying from the mire of racism. Amen. Dr. Charlene Jen Lee is an exceptional leader, teacher, speaker, preacher, academic, and pastoral person who has been blessed with the skills and graces to relate to folks from all walks of life. I've had the dear privilege of glimpsing the essence of her special personhood as we have served together in a ministry with our homeless and food-deprived friends here in Pasadena. Charlene is valued throughout this region and throughout our nation for her seminars, workshops, keynotes, and mentoring leadership. She is a columnist for the Presbyterian Outlook. This afternoon, she will explore with us the pioneering womanist ethics and theology of Katie Geneva Cannon, a revered doctoral mentor at Union Presbyterian Seminary. I give you Charlene Jin Lee.
Thank you, my respected and beloved friends at Monte Vista Grove Homes. It is a true joy and a privilege to spend this afternoon with you and to see you in your living rooms and kitchens and homes that I would not have the privilege of seeing if we were meeting in your gathering space. So thank you for inviting me into your home, and you are welcome into mine here in LA. Love makes the soul crawl out from its hiding place. Love makes the soul crawl out from its hiding place. These guiding and healing words were written by Zora Neale Hurston, who was a subject of study and a prolific writer and mentor to my mentor, Katie Geneva Cannon. If my soul has been parched these long and trying months, as we try to make sense of a world spinning with anxiety and fear, isolation and uncertainty, mistrust and injustice, I want to thank you, my parched or my once parched soul wants to thank you for this invitation to reflect with you this afternoon, because in preparing for this talk, my soul has been revived, nourished again by love, as I attempt to capture language and story to the life and work of a giant soul that had hovered over me and continues to hover over me now. My preparation for my brief remarks here this afternoon, as I remembered again my mentor, my preparation has been accompanied by tears flowing without notice and heart swelling with gratitude as I remember again the radical generosity, the genuine curiosity, and deliberate attention, love, that I have received from my beloved teacher, who lost a fierce and all too fast battle with leukemia, August 2018. Marking this for me only the second beginning of the academic year, where I am embarking forward without the usual pre-academic year phone conversation with Katie Cannon. The Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon was the soul of every place, changing the texture and temperature of every place she entered. The intensity of her incisive attention and the roundness of her earthly welcome set a temperature that made you want to take off your outer cloak, and you would feel that outer cloak's tired weight clad with detached abstractions and with clatter of impressive symbols that erudite minds with restless souls feel we need to carry with us to garner recognition in the public sphere. Katie Cannon's giant soul would engulf every pretentious or timid ego right in her presence. Her truth summoned each one to show up with depth, with truth, with substance, sufficient for genuine encounter. She had a way of calling the soul from its hiding place. As one who has had this very precious privilege to be called into and to grow my voice beneath the canopy of this truth-telling giant soul, I want to extend this gracious canopy with you by sharing with you my reflections on how this brilliant scholar, gifted teacher, and working prophet has imparted to me roadmaps to memory and imagination, has given me toolkits for releasing the poetry stuck in my bones, and certification that assured my stunningly particular self a legitimate position in the collective singing of what it means to be human, what it means to strive to be fully human in a lopsided world, a very lopsided world that will be made right, that will be made just when God's kingdom reigns, when God's people bring about that kingdom imperfectly yet faithfully on earth as it is in heaven. I recognize that Katie Geneva Cannon may be an unfamiliar or a new name for some of you, a familiar name for some, and a beloved one for others. So now that you've heard her name many times, let me share with you my favorite picture of Katie Cannon. Teaching is my ministry. I love to teach, to empower, to equip, to set people free, to live into the graces and gifts they've been given. I have built a muscular soul, and my unsure voice had found its place and its continuing growth under the canopy of this giant soul who recognized the graces and gifts dwelling in me. Katie Cannon, as a teacher, taught in several institutions at Harvard Divinity School, at Episcopal Divinity School, at Temple University, and from 2001, when I began my doctoral work at Union Presbyterian Seminary, then Union Theological Seminary and Presbyterian School of Christian Education. From 2001 until her death in 2018, she served as the Annie Scales Rogers Professor of Christian Social Ethics in Richmond. It was there when I sat in her doctoral seminar, sitting across her and next to my fellow colleagues. I found myself sitting in her first doctoral seminar, not knowing that the magic of her pedagogy would fashion my vocation with love, that my scholarship might be fashioned with love, that I would learn to order my steps with dignified stride following hers, and that my vocation would be fashioned with an insistence on living and doing the work my soul must have. Dr. Cannon was the recipient of many academic honors and awards, including Distinguished Professor Awards from Spelman College and the Distinguished Alumna Designation at both Barbara Scotia College and John C. Smith Theological Seminary at the Interdenominational Theological Center. She also served as the Sterling Brown Visiting Professor in Religion and African American Studies at William College, the Lilly Distinguished Visiting Scholar of Religion at Davidson College, the Rockefeller Scholar in Residence at the Center of Study of Black Literature and Culture at the University of Pennsylvania. She has more accolades, but that would take me too long for me to list. She may be very more well known to our community as being the first African-American woman ordained in what was then the United Presbyterian Church USA. Do you know what year that was? I know you're muted, so you can think it. Think of that where you were in 1974. That was when quietly in a presbytery in North Carolina, the first young Black woman was ordained with very little fanfare and with no national announcement following that historic and important mark of our church. She was a renowned womanist theologian. I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, and a social ethicist. She was honored at the American Academy of Religion for excellence in teaching recently in 2011, where I was able to accompany her for that honor. She was also honored at the recently concluded General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA. And perhaps some of you got chance to see the video of that or related to that honor a few years ago. Amongst her many writings, and I thought I would share this with you so that if you are interested in kind of peering a little bit more into her scholarship, you might consider a few of these more well-known monographs. Let's see. Is Katie's Cannon, Womanism and the Soul of the Black Community. You might notice here, there's been a very wonderful play of her last name. Perfect last name for a Bible scholar, which is really how she started her academic work as an Old Testament student at Union Theological Seminary, New York. Katie's Cannon. Her name actually does not come from a great dignity in its origin. Her family in Kannapolis, North Carolina, worked for generations and generations in the Cannon mills. You may remember Cannon towels. Maybe you have some in your household now. I think that I did a little research. I think they've been bought by Fieldcrest. So she comes from a generation of people for whom, when they talked about ethnographic research and field work, they were talking about field work as in working in the fields and not field work as in a disciplined study. She writes about that in this monograph, Katie's Cannon. And in more recent years, these are two that I'd like to introduce to you. One is Teaching Preaching. She is one of those people, much like many of you, who are both an academic. Oops. Let me get back to us. Okay, let me stop there. Both an academic, a pastor, a teacher, and a brilliant preacher. So that one was her reflection on another Black preacher that was her mentor as well. Let me see if I can get back to that screen. Okay. So that you can, okay. There we go. And a more recent collection of essays and papers is the Womanist Theological Ethics, a reader that she had co-edited with Emily Towns, who is now at Vanderbilt, was at that time at Yale Divinity, and Angela Sims, who is now the president of Colgate, at Colgate University, the Divinity School there. Okay, let me stop my share there. She is also very well known in the Union Theological Seminary, New York community, and was awarded kind of their highest distinguished honor there. She was the first African-American woman to earn the PhD from that institution. I'd mentioned that she had begun as an Old Testament candidate, doctoral candidate. She came across a professor, she tells about this anecdotally, and I think she has written about it in one of her essays, where she was constantly questioned who wrote her papers, because the professors could not be convinced that this a student that looks like her in her skin and her body would be able to produce the exegetical rigor and insight that she produced. She kept on pressing forward, and then came across one particular professor that pretty much let her know that she will not be able to graduate out of there with a PhD in the Old Testament. He disdained her writing as one that was not neutral enough. It was too embodied of human emotion and experience. It was a paper that she wrote for a New Testament, actually at that time I think it was a New Testament course on the Passion of Christ and the pericopes from that section of the gospel. And she could not understand why her Christian faith that she has been nurtured, she is a cradled Presbyterian, could not have a voice and could not have a conversation, a dialogue, by her convictions of her beliefs and the experiences of her body, of her visions, of her prayers, could not be incorporated as a source text in these exegetical papers. And then she decided there are times, and this is what she has told me as well, there are times to announce your truth. There are times to delay your truth for a little while so you can get through some of the menacing obstacles that might come your way when you are speaking your truth. And she shifted to ethics as her discipline and received her PhD in ethics at Union Theological Seminary. In her classroom, Dr. Cannon had a way of looking at you when you spoke, a look that made you believe she was expecting to hear something important that only you could deliver. She looked at you waiting to learn, and you did not want to disappoint the anticipation of this intellectual giant by attempting a sputtering of premium words at discount substance. You would not get by for long because her equally giant soul would be startled by your disembodied statements and let you know you have got to remember your dismembered body and do some work to rebuild or build anew muscles around your soul. She would let you know this by blinking her eyes at an indeliberate speed. It was her instinctive reaction to the shock that anyone would waste time trying so hard to be an impressive talking head, speaking of abstractions, a glossy shell of ideas without the warmth of flesh. just a glossy shell of ideas floating here and there, making appearances, but incapable of engendering worthwhile knowledge, worthwhile action, worthy theology, and worthy ethics. It was there in that doctoral seminar in Watts Hall of Union Presbyterian Seminary that I learned the agency and build the substance of my voice, learning to show up with pursuit of excellence, with pursuit of meaning, with pursuit of authenticity of self, of words, of intentions, of language. Dr. Cannon at first amplified my voice by adding hers to mine, then fading away until one day I heard the fullness of my solo sound. At times, the sound of my own silence breaking palpitated with boom, boom, surprising myself at the cadence and rhythms of my own truths. In Watts Hall, in that small classroom, the four of us and our professor sat around a pentagon configuration of tables. She never lectured to people sitting in rows behind tables and chairs. She created a physical space of community, whether it was a classroom of 4, a classroom of 40. We moved around a lot of furniture, both as a student and I as a teaching assistant for her MDiv level courses. And we would read aloud, announce, she would say, our long and boring papers to one another. And I can still hear the rustle of autumn leaves within arm's reach outside the half-open window as we tried very patiently to listen to one another. But Dr. Cannon, she listened. She listened as if we were scholars. She regarded our sentences, the baby idea still incubating in them. She listened to them with concise curiosity and engaged them with a depth of intellectual inquiry that we knew the caliber of our papers did not merit. Soon, however, because of the expectation that she placed on us, that she expected to learn something from us that only we each could deliver, soon we were writing as if we were indeed scholars, and indeed we were on our way to our own paths of scholarship, teaching, ministry, and life. A challenging part of this announcing work is the question about legitimate knowledge. And this is the work of womanist theology and womanist ethics. What kind of knowledge is legitimate? Whose knowledge is legitimate? In the womanist classroom, epistemological hegemony is reordered. The order of epistemology of how we value what we know and how we know it was reordered. Dispassionate objectivity is debunked, and passionate subjectivity enters the central discourse. There are not just textbooks that we would read as the sources for our learning. Multiple texts occupy the womanist classroom. Multiple texts occupy the learning space and share the responsibility of teaching. In Dr. Cannon's classroom, legitimate knowledge was found in the voicing of living texts that each of us carry, in the forgotten narratives that would emerge with public language, in the muted voices of struggle now excavated from the brittle rocks of unrecorded, unwritten history, and forgotten or dismissed in the printed pages of textbooks. The liberative possibilities of this dialogical understanding of what curriculum is, what legitimate knowledge is in an academic setting, was important, especially and very critical for those whose social and political situation demand a new synthesis. For those who live and think and do our work outside of the reified male patriarchal understanding of what is legitimate knowledge. For those whose lived texts are inadequately grasped by existing categories, by the status quo of norms of what is included in the canon and the public canon. A reassessment of these value assignments creates new channels for announcing. Having dug herself the underground, the above ground channels of her own announcing work, Dr. Cannon accompanied us in working through our embedded self-afflicting subscriptions to the established hierarchy of knowledge. I learned the responsibility of interrupting public knowledge with discourses particular to my location, my identity, and my experience. Many years after having left Richmond, I often have thought about Dr. Cannon while moving heavy desks on my own as I faced likely and unlikely students in my seminary classrooms, in my undergraduate classrooms, and in my very first classroom of teaching middle school English to students here in East LA, where now I currently live 20 years after my first classroom. That has led me to who I am and what I'm doing here today. That first middle school classroom in East LA in the late 90s, when the community here was still infested with gang violence and regular drive-by shootings. So in my own classrooms, I have configured pentagons and hexagons, squares and amoebas amongst my students who grumblingly moved their tables in a classroom of 7 or in a classroom of 30. I created my own versions of the Womanist classroom. In these spaces, we see one another. We listen. We announce. We earnestly wait to be transformed by the interruption of the public contours of knowledge by an unfamiliar voice. In those first years, I was tempted to prove myself as a professor in the room, especially when I walked into my first MDiv classroom at San Francisco Theological Seminary, and people assumed that I was one of the students, and I stood up to the lectern, and there I was. And what I had learned is that when I can claim my own voice in the honesty and the authenticity of my soul, I can and become more than what society and what people's assumptions of value assignments have been given to me. And that oftentimes for me, my faithfulness in responding to God's call is not to sit in the back, but to make my way to the front, to not wait in the margins, but take boldly my steps to the center of a place, and to offer my soul in every place that God calls me. I've always remembered that the powerful language of humility in Dr. Cannon's praxis. And I contend that humility is the secret language of good teachers. Recalling Dr. Cannon's claim that a professor is simply one who professes, I continue to embrace my vocation and announce my professions with agency and substance of my truthful voice. I have learned that this is more than enough to be a good teacher. The gift of womanist theology and the construction of a new branch of theological inquiry that Dr. Cannon and her colleagues had brought to our theological education, our theological imagination to the shape of our hermeneutical work in the church and in the academy is the inclusion of the voices that have been disregarded, dismissed, or disdained, and in particular, the voices and the experiences of people who are subjugated historically and in contemporary life, and that is the voices and experiences of female Black people. She recognized that she had within her gifts of an inheritance of religious imagination of people who survived with faith through 500 years of chattel slavery, of segregation in formal and informal ways, of continuous lynching in the public square, to every door that had been bolted against them. If we can't look to this resource as a rich well from which the Christian people who testify to a God of hope, if we can't look to that well as a source for our own reviving life, as a source for our both scholarly and lived faith, our scholarly work and our lived faith, then the church there would be a deficit in the church, a deficit in the community. So she has worked strategically with cogent argumentation and with a large and giant soul to pave the way to bring forth the realities rising and emerging from locations far from where the normed center has been for a very long time, in the Presbyterian Church, in the church at large, and in society here in the United States and in our global context. And so she brings legitimacy to experience, legitimacy to emotions, to memory, to imaginations, to faith, into the academic work of theology, what she would call God words. We will speak our own language about God, for God is vast, God is knowable, but mostly God is unknown. And so the intellectual monopoly that has held its place in the academy and throughout the institutions need to be dislodged by prophets in our midst, by prophetesses in our midst, who will bring to us a fresh voice, to bring to us areas where our blind spots are so layered that even when we think we are understanding, we are still not seeing. Even when we think we are hearing, we are not listening. She would always say, the poor people will always know more about the rich people than the rich people will ever know about the poor people. And so for those of us who are rich by any measure, and for some of us by every measure, the faithful work that is calling us, the faithful work in light of the God we serve, our Creator who calls us now and calls us to the kingdom of the beloved community. I am convinced that the work that has been set before us to begin to see, to practice, to listen, to step far from where we are, to go to the places where there is suffering and hurting, to dare to look in a disciplined way, the underbelly of what we know as reality. For each of us only knows one slice, one skinny slice of the reality of the human experience. And yet some of us are given the privilege, the platform, and the affirmation that our one slice of the human experience is the universal experience, and that it is neutral, objective, natural. And we need to begin to see that there are those who are suffering and striving and are subjugated because of the monopoly that we hold on to as what is truth, what is natural, what is neutral, what is universal. So I think the womanist theological ethics brings to light the necessity and the particularity of the particular self, the necessity of the particular self, and to bring to that particular voice agency and currency in institutional life, in scholarship, in ecclesial life, to bring to it agency and currency where influence can be made for the better of not just those who are subjugated, but for those who hold on to a centrality of power, a centrality of meaning making, and to help mend their deficit from their blind spots and from their unknown and known, overt and covert ways in which that centrality of power is grasped and held onto and maintained. And I think Katie Cannon's gift was not only does she have the prophetic voice and the prophetic message, she had the graces and gifts to honor all people, even those who stubbornly will not be dislodged from their place at the center. She remembers this when she taught actually an undergraduate class. While she was at Harvard Divinity School, she actually taught an undergraduate class of Harvard College students. And at that time, all of the students in her classroom were young men, elites from our nation who had made their way to the campus in Cambridge. And by the second week, all of them in unison had dropped her course and she had no students. For these young men, the image and the physical presence of a person that looked and felt and walked like Katie Cannon caused such a cognitive dissonance, because for them, they had only seen people who looked like her in the muted, marginal edges of their dining rooms, who silently served their families. As she reflected on this story, even as in that first doctoral seminar I told you about, there was one white male doctoral student who by the second week dropped that course, citing a schedule conflict. She offered graces and gifts for those for whom this cognitive dissonance may have been too much to handle, and that she will wait for a day when that would not dislodge them to the point where they wouldn't be able to accompany and walk alongside others with a teacher that doesn't look or sound or seem as one that they presume with authority. I want to close my remarks by speaking just briefly about kind of what's happening in our current contemporary world today, not in whole, and I know all of you probably have more wise perspective and insights to offer than what I can offer here. But as a person of color, I recall coming back home from a travel abroad last year. It was when the Muslim bans were, happening, when a lot of our civic national discourse and rhetoric was one with a lot of divisive language against people who didn't look like what we assume as the typical American. And I remember coming home and the plane was taxiing and I was scrolling through my phone and I had not looked at any really kind of domestic news. And I was scrolling through some news feeds and I came across a picture. It was a picture of a man in a cowboy hat in Irving, Texas, holding up a sign on the street. It was a giant sign. And I thought, oh no, here's another sign telling me that I don't belong here, probably saying, go back to your country on this sign. It is a taunt that is very familiar to me It is one that I have been on the receiving end of many times in my life here in the United States. It is a very lonely place to be. Then I looked close and I zoomed in, and this picture was of this older gentleman in a traditional cowboy hat, standing by himself on the street in Irving, Texas, with a giant sign. And it said, "You belong. We are one America. Be blessed, stay strong." And of course, somebody driving by took a picture and put it on Facebook or something. It kind of went viral, and soon reporters had, come and found this man. And this man told the reporter, who actually, I should say, would proudly identified himself as a Presbyterian. He said, "This, in my faith tradition, teaches me to wash my brothers and sisters' feet. And this was an expression of my Christian discipleship, and this was my prayer." He was standing by himself for several hours in front of the community mosque, the big mosque in his neighborhood. And he felt that his Christian discipleship was to stand there with that sign. I pray that bearing witness and putting legs to our love, extending hands to our confessions of faith, might be the fruit of our ministries from wherever we are to wherever we are called. I want to offer you these last two words, and then we will open up for brief questions. I'm sorry, I was not paying so much attention to the time, so forgive me, but I do want to offer you this image. So Geneva Cannon, the prolific writer and scholar that she was, always spent the summers going to art workshops. She believed that every academic needs to have a creative output, whatever it might be, so that you don't go insane. So some of her artwork is well known, and this one kind of captures a sampling of her work. Sorry, I thought I was sharing. Now I'm sharing now. Let's see. And with this backdrop, I want to offer you a word that stays with me, and I want to find it so I read it correctly. A woman in harmony with her spirit is like a river flowing. She goes where she will without pretense and arrives at her destination prepared to be herself and only herself. These words are from another prolific prophet, Maya Angelou. It captures the essence of what Dr. Cannon showed and embodied and displayed and made incarnate for me to learn from. It captures the woman that I aspire to be. And I leave you with this word for all of you who are teachers and called preachers and pastors, all of you who are trailblazers in your own right, all of you who have been a teacher and mentor to so many. Shall we read these words together? The Lord God has given me the tongue of a teacher, that I may know how to sustain the weary with a word. Morning by morning, the Lord wakens my ear to listen as those who are taught. Amen.
Amen. We are so indebted to you, Dr. Lee, and we'll follow through with as many questions as we can accommodate. We remind you to type in questions, and we'll try to get to them in the remaining time. You mentioned Katie's reaction to resistance. Lynn Cheney wants you to follow up on that. She says that she imagines, as you've pointed out, that Katie faced a great deal of resistance when pushing against the non-reforming nature of the status quo. Again, how did she handle that resistance as you remember her best? That's Lynn's question.
Yeah. That's a great question. There's something that she said to me many times in my own navigating through kind of the treacherous world of academic institutional life. She said, people's rejection is often God's protection for you. And I carry with that as somebody who has experienced rejection, but knowing that she has experienced quite a bit of rejection, although she walks with such joy and dignity and really seeing the graces and gifts in people. And I think that comes from her faith in the Almighty God who has ordained her life. Who has ordained and has orchestrated her life. She does recall often in her writings the faith and teachings of our mother and a grandmother. One of her very early books is called, with a group of other scholars, is called Inheriting Our Mother's Gardens. And there she reflects on the well from which she drinks, which is the persistent, hopeful spirituality and religious imagination of her mothers and her mother and her grandmother.
Charlene, you used the term kingdom twice, and I take it that perhaps comes from Katie's heart. Maybe that's your own word, but explain to us, as a womanist ethicist and theologian, why you would use the word kingdom.
Thank you. So one of Katie Cannon's gifts to me was that she would take me to a lot of places, and that's what mentors know, where to bring their students to the places, to expose them, to give them a seat at the table. And amongst many of those travels, she had introduced me to one of her colleagues, Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, who is kind of the what Katie Cannon is to women's theology, a scholar that has, kind of given public voice to Hispanic women's liberation theology. And actually my doctoral work centers around Ada Maria Isasi Diaz's work. And it is in her body of work where she coins, or she kind of captures the meaning and purpose and intent behind the kingdom, to kind of minimize the association of patriarchy and authority given to this idea of monarch, kind of kingship, kingdom. It would be a place where there's equity and inclusion and kinship. And so part of, language, as you all know, is a powerful tool. It can change the world. And so in every small world that I'm invited to be in, whether I have a chance to explain or not, I do practice my own way of resistance and announcing by when appropriate, and even when not so appropriate, I will use kingdom to affirm what I understand as God's reign.
Thanks, Charlene. That's a great teaching word. From our colleague, William Craig. He would like to know how you compare the teachings of Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon with those of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Is there any bridging or connecting?
That's a big question. I think certainly so. I mean, I think the imagination of something that isn't here, that isn't present, when there is no sight of hope that vision could materialize, when actually the conditions around us show us that actually it's actually absurd to imagine such a vision. I think that is the work of prophets, in ways that I think it was Howard Thurman that said something about what a prophet is, and I'm going to get it wrong, so I'll just paraphrase how I understood that reading. Was about how sometimes God captures the imagination of certain people for a particular time and place to see in a very concrete way something that you should not be able to see based on logic, based on observation of what can be true, what could be the possibility. And so I think if that identity, if that's a quality of prophetic work, I think that they share that, certainly. Being, a pioneer first in many cases as the first, female Black preacher, and as the first, female PhD in Christian ethics. And she had to step into something that didn't exist. I know that for me growing up, I had not seen, like many of you, I imagine for most of you who are women, did not see growing up a vision of somebody who looked like you doing the work that you have done and are doing. And you can't be what you can't see. You can't be what you don't know. You can't be what you don't exist. And so I think there is a way in which the Spirit inserts and imparts and captures the hearts and imagination of ordinary people to step into identities and roles and calls that is God's own. That was not, I don't think they answered the question, but I made an attempt.
A great answer. Lynn Cheney, again, can you tell us more about the origin of Katie's breakthrough into womanist thought? Who were her teachers? What were some of the experiences that prompted her to say no to the prevailing notion that women need not think to contribute to theological conversation?
Yeah.
Mentors, breakthroughs.
I think she found herself in a cohort of women emerging through New York Theological Seminary, Union Theological Seminary in New York, at a time when James Cone's scholarship was, being regarded in kind of public theological inquiry and discourse at that time. And other colleagues with her, other African-American women scholars who were coming in as students at that time. Key for her, for Katie Cannon, was her own doctoral advisor, who was a white female ethicist, Beverly Harrison. Her well-known book, some of you may recall, I think is called Making the Connections, a really remarkable book that I know I have in my bookshelf somewhere because I do go back to it quite often. And Katie Cannon would write all these papers, on all these theologians that she was to read. She'd always tell me, you got to read the canon, you got to know it inside and out, and then you have to do the work to know your own story and your own voice and create your own, construct your own theology. So you have to read even when the lights are out. And so that's what she did. And so she would, write all these papers, and Beverly Harrison would tell her, no, that's already been written. People are writing about that. We already know that. We already know about all these, what she would say, dead white men that every seminarian has studied. And so she said, okay, well, then she wrote the theologies of the Niebuhr brothers, thinking that's more contemporary. And Beverly Harrison said, no, I want you to write something that only you can write. And she said, what? You want me to write about my family, my mothers, who are your ancestors, and what have they imparted to you that you can bring light or add to and contribute to this enterprise of theological inquiry? And it took somebody in a position of power, maybe not perfect power as a female scholar in her own right, Beverly Harrison, to give her permission to voice what is authentic and true. And that authenticity is what was the breakthrough and the pathway that was given to her through that white feminist scholar, and in an institution that was imperfect, but ready for emerging voices to find, a public platform. So I would say that was one pivotal experience in her life.
I take it
Being allies.
I take it she and Dolores Williams were colleagues.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Sharpen
Yes.
one.
And
Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Please
No,
go
I
ahead.
was going to say, I mean, there are so many others, but Emily Towns and she had, been really best friends and colleagues throughout their academic professions.
Charlene, we owe you so much, and we have been taught, and you have been such a wonderful explainer of womanist ethics, both as you point to Katie Geneva Cannon, but also so dearly as you point to your own personhood and your own insights. So we are dearly indebted to you, and we hope to have you back. Charlene, next week we have Steve Yamaguchi, and he's pastor at the congregation in Tokyo Union, the Tokyo Union congregation, and he will be our guest on October 1. Thanks again for being our teacher today. We're dearly indebted to you. And we're going to sign out and invite you to come back again. Take good care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. My love to all of you.